Ask Mr. Sal. This episode is about the Vietnam conflict. This is part 2 of the Ask Mr. Sal about the Vietnam conflict. We're going to discuss the Kennedy years and Lyndon Baines Johnson years and go from there. All right, here we go. Okay, we're going to talk about the domino theory. The domino theory was you had North and South, and I forget exactly where the line was, but we'll leave it here. North and South Vietnam. North was communist, South wasn't. People felt that if the South became communist, like dominoes, if you have a whole line of dominoes lined up and one falls over, the others start to fall. So if we already had China become communist up here, but if Vietnam becomes communist, then Laos, Cambodia, possibly Thailand, Burma, which is now Myanmar, Malaysia, all of these areas could then become communist. The domino theory, once one falls, they all fall. That is the theory that we were trying to prevent against. Remember, the Cold War's raging. So if you're friends with the communists, you're not our friend. If you're not a communist, if you're an anti-communist, you don't have to be a nice person. You are our friend. So we're back on the overview. I'm still listening to real jazz on satellite radio, which is affecting my voice. We're doing the overview of Vietnam. On the radar, we've covered the early years. We're getting into the Kennedy years. We just talked about the domino theory. Once one country falls, the others will fall too. That was our fear. We didn't want all these countries to become communist. So Kennedy ups the advisors. As time goes on, we start adding more and more advisors. Remember, they're not guys in ties and briefcases. They are U.S. Special Forces soldiers. They're elite fighters. They know how to train people to fight. And they're fighting different rebels in South Vietnam. They are fighting the North Vietnamese insurgents, the communists. They're trying to keep the government propped up and train the South Vietnamese army to fight for themselves. That's the goal of these advisors, to keep South Vietnam from turning communist and keep them able to fight them, train them to fight for themselves. So Kennedy wants to resist. He resists sending troops for open warfare, open combat. His goal is to prop up the government. As time goes on, President Diem is seen as a problem, he and his brother. He is given the option, hey, if you step down, we will protect you because a lot of people don't like you, man. And he says, no, I'm not stepping down. He's overthrown by his own forces. I've read conflicting statements that, yes, we openly helped overthrow him. Others we didn't really help overthrow, but we told his generals, we're not going to really pay attention. And he's assassinated because when you're a dictator and there's regime change, it usually doesn't end well. He should have taken a deal, in my opinion. He didn't, and he did not survive. The only problem is the new government wasn't that good. They were still unstable. So even though we get rid of a bad dictatorial president, the next guy isn't any better, and I don't have his name at this moment in time. I'm not going to worry about it right now, not to offend anybody, but this is just a quick overview. So, November 1963, President Diem was overthrown. Soon thereafter, Kennedy is assassinated. In comes Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ. In 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin incident. There are conflicting reports. 2 destroyers. The Maddox, and I believe the second one is, what is the second one's name? Turner Joy, I want to say, but I am not positive. Let me look that up because I'm on the U.S. government site as we scroll down, and I'm buying some time. And they're not listing the names of those ships. So I'm going to pause. Yes, I was correct. The Maddox and the Turner Joy, conflicting reports with the Gulf of Tonkin. The act, the United States had given the approval of some commando raids by the South Vietnamese forces on North Vietnamese installations. And the one story I read that the U.S. Navy didn't realize these attacks had gone on. As the North Vietnamese came out after the commandos, they saw our ships there, thought they were part of the attack, fired on them. We skated, went back with the second ship a little bit later, and they thought we were part of the attacking force. Then other reports I read, there was all kinds of chaos going on. People thought they were attacked but weren't really attacked. So there's all kinds of conflicting reports that the North Vietnamese confused us because there was other military action going on. These attacks may not have gone on. We sunk some of their ships. We didn't sustain any damage. But perception is the big key here. It was perceived as an attack on the United States without provocation, that they just started gunning at us. So the House and Senate pass a resolution that gives the president authority to use force to protect American forces. So the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, that gave the president the ability to defend U.S. forces. From what I've read on some government sites, and I don't know how true this is because this is before I was born, Congress, House, and Senate thought, well, before he continues, this will protect the forces that are there, but before it's a big escalation, he'll come back to us. Johnson doesn't do that. Nixon, when he steps in, spoiler alert, Nixon's the next president, he doesn't go back to Senate and the House. They continue the combat, and that's where things get hazy. So we're going to zoom out here. LBJ starts sending in combat troops. We go from advisors to troops going in to fight. And then in February 1965, we have what's called Rolling Thunder. This runs from February 1965 to October 1968. The strategy involved, they are going to bomb North Vietnamese installations. Now, I keep talking about perception and how we view things. Johnson and his advisors, from what I've read, they wanted the North Vietnamese to negotiate and get out of the war. Their thought was, we're going to label a bunch of targets from the most important down to the least important. We're going to start with the least important targets, start bombing them, and work our way up the list to give the North Vietnamese a way out of this situation. Let them save face, peace with honor, give them a way out. Thinking if we just go for the high priority, high value targets, they're going to get angry and they're going to not want to negotiate because they're angry with us. So we start with the least important and work our way up. Also, there was a thought that we don't want to antagonize Russia and China. Remember, with Korea, when we bombed the daylights out of Korea and we went too far, that brought the Chinese into the war, and that made it very hard to manage. So we didn't want to bring the Soviets or the communist Chinese into this war. So, we want to let the North Vietnamese save face, show them, hey, we're serious, like we're bombing things, and we're starting to get more and more value in our targets, and we didn't want our other enemies to pile into the war. The North Vietnamese took it like, well, you're bombing stuff, but you're bombing stuff that doesn't really matter. So that's a sign of weakness. This difference in perception allows Rolling Thunder to fail. We're looking at it as being strategic and letting them save face. They're looking at it like we're not serious and we're kind of afraid. And this difference in how Rolling Thunder was occurring, and we dropped a ton of bombs. We dropped more bombs in Vietnam than we did in all of the European theater in World War II. That's a lot of weaponry, a lot of bombs. And that just totally threw the strategy off. See if I can zoom out a little bit more. By the end of 1968, we had over 500,000 troops in Vietnam. How do we get that many troops? We instituted the draft, and it caused many issues. You had deferments for education and health and other issues. But this drafting people, many were lower economic groups. They were sent overseas to fight. And finally, 1968, there were Paris peace talks between the United States and the Vietnamese. The problem was, during this time, you have a lot of protests in public. People are protesting the war. The nation's starting to become divided. At this point in time, Johnson chooses not to run for re-election. So you have a president who's not running. You have a war going on. And the Vietnamese stall because they know Johnson's not going to run for re-election. So there's going to be a new president one way or another. And that leaves us off in 1968. Over 500,000 troops fighting, American troops fighting. There's some other countries, and we'll talk about that to answer some of the casualty rates and things you guys asked about. But we're going to leave off here in this little part 2 of the tutorial. We'll pick up with a part 3, which will include Nixon, a little bit of Ford, and some miscellaneous questions. Have a good one, guys. See you in a bit. I originally failed to mention the Tet Offensive, which occurred in January of 1968 over the Vietnamese New Year, a holiday. Usually, over holidays, you don't expect attacks. The North Vietnamese and the rebels in the South attacked over the Vietnamese New Year, and initially they did some damage. And this is where the perception versus the reality comes in. American forces, South Vietnamese forces regrouped rather quickly and added tons and tons of casualties, killed many of the North Vietnamese troops and the communist rebels. The reality of the situation was the Americans and South Vietnamese killed way more people, did way more damage in this surprise attack on them, fighting defensively and then counterattacking than the North Vietnamese did. The perception was, though, that because of the surprise attack, the North Vietnamese could surprise, and it was a blow to troop morale, the morale of the people back home. The way it was played in the press, it came across as a loss, even though it was a victory in the long run, it was a victory for the Americans and the South Vietnamese forces. So the perception comes across as a loss. The reality was we had won that battle in the long run, but perception means a lot. It helped change people's opinion towards the war, and it started turning America against the war even more than some people were turning against the fighting over in Vietnam. So that was one of the questions that popped up. We're not going to get into numbers. You don't need to know specific numbers. You can look those up. But this is more of a perception versus reality. Militarily, we won that battle, but the perception was that we were caught off guard, and it was bad for the Americans, and it hurt the war effort overall. They're your questions, my answers, thoroughly researched by several different sites as I go through and fact check from the books that I've read on Vietnam, the history books, and other websites I've used. So, hitting up different parts of research to get you the answers you are looking for. This episode is written by us, you and me.